Yeah, no, it's a huge, huge topic, and even though we had a very long panel, we can't get to everything, and I would have loved to have gone there. There was a point where I was wanting to go that direction too. But the question is, I mean, I have a huge amount of respect for him, but I still wouldn't say that we are sure what we should do next. And I think, if you look around, that in the old days, people used to say that the best way to limit corruption was to have a government and a bunch of mid-sized companies, and they all kind of keep track of each other, right? We've all seen some governments that have fallen to very corrupt things recently, and we've seen an assault on democracy, of course. So I think that brings home the fact. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone I trust with my cybersecurity more than Google, because I'm not saying that I trust them perfectly, but they work really hard at it. And the European Union, I have a huge respect for the European Union, but and they're invested a massive amount into servers, so data servers, to try to have public data servers to compete with the private data servers like in America and China. Well, the thing is that they don't have chip manufacturing. There's no chip manufacturing in Europe. I mean, it's inconceivable. And Google makes their own chips because they don't trust anybody else because of the cybersecurity aspects. So, and Google has its own fiber optic cables all the way around the world, right? They don't even let other companies' fiber optics in the same cables with them because they know that people are doing things like detecting the light going down fiber optics. So, that's now, I would say, an international asset. We've all contributed to the data that helped Google become Google. And I think it's a really interesting question. I actually think that these large companies now, the same thing with Facebook, we've all contributed, it was our lived experience that built the communities that made Facebook what it is. Although it's also definitely their algorithms. Like I said, this is a huge amount of engineering, and the things that they've put together and their capacity to be able to serve like so many people in a day is incredible. That's a huge amount of hardware too, and energy, right? So it's a amazing piece of engineering. I don't want to knock the companies for having done it, but it's definitely something that we've all co-built. One of the things when you have such high levels of communication is that it gets harder to find the borders of where does the company end and its customers start, right? You can say things like, well, you're not getting paid, but we kind of are getting paid. We're all bartering for data. So we're giving them information, and we're getting entertainment and information from them, right? So we're all sort of working for them. And yeah. Well, it's like it's almost like the opposite of the pop psych schizophrenic. Instead of having multiple personalities, it's like one giant merged personality, right? But anyway, so the problem is that I think one of the things I'm toying with and is that we should be treating companies almost more like governments, and that we strike treaties with them about, like, if you want to do business in this region, then you have to, for example, play appropriately with redistribution, so we can see their estimated worth go up in a year, and we can say, okay, your estimated worth went up 100 billion last year, and we know that a large fraction of your business happened in Europe, and let's say a fifth of your business happened in Europe, right? Well, then we should be able to tax a fifth of that 100 billion, right? And I think, because it used to be that we did taxes based on income, but with bartering, you don't know, there was no denomination of that transaction. And further, these companies mostly are doing these things on speculation, right? So they don't even know what the value of the data is when they harvest it. They just kind of keep it around until they think of something, right? So I think it's really important that we sort of construct these new social contracts. And I don't think what some countries would love is if you we're able to, say that, like, oh, let's get all this power and wealth and tax money back into one country. But I don't think that would be fair, right? I don't think it makes sense. Certainly, it shouldn't be the Canary Islands, but I'm not even sure it makes sense for America to suddenly capture all this money that did come out of their inadequate regulation that these companies ever got this much power in the first place, right? So I think that that now we want to have transnational treaties, but I do think the problems will be that China and America will try to maintain control of these companies and their wealth. But I think again we can build treaties with them too. So and I'm not saying that companies can completely replace governments. Governments do incredibly important things. They're the means by which we coordinate with our neighbors, and what our neighbors do really matters. It matters how well educated their kids are. It matters whether the kids are vaccinated. It matters whether their houses are fireproof, because if their house is on fire, it's a lot harder to keep your house from going on fire. The clean air, the clean water. There's a million ways that it matters what your neighbors do, and so there will always be some kind of local government, right? But I think that maybe some of the things we used to let government do for us, we're going to be using companies to do instead. And so now, rather than having mid-sized companies in a national government, we should be thinking about these mega companies and transnational governance means for negotiating with them and treaties, and then hopefully we can use that both to keep the companies honest and not allow the neglect, the misuse of our data as the EU has been negotiating with the GDPR, but also to help keep our governments honest, right? Because that is one of the problems. I mean, it was really fascinating watching the Canadians doing a better job of questioning Mark Zuckerberg than the British did. Well, why? Because the British government that's is in because of Zuckerberg, right? So, whereas the Canadians are saying, look, Brexit is costing us a fortune. I mean, you think it's costing everybody a fortune, not just the EU, right? So they're like we care what's going on with our Commonwealth members, America and Britain. I mean, we're not Commonwealth members. What is it, Five Eyes? Anyway, we're strategic partners, and the Canadians cared, and they did a better job of questioning Zuckerberg and Facebook in general, not just Zuckerberg, than either the British or the Americans. So that's the kind of things we need. We need to be able to have interdependencies and rely on each other to get at the truth.
We used to speak about US with GAFAM and China with BATX. Do you think that, in fact, that you mentioned GDPR, Europe is a good framework to find out a third way and to reboot or to define, to design a new kind of diplomacy around this kind of hot topic, to provoke a new model, to design a new model, in fact, for not only for Europe, probably to be safer for other people for China, in Asia, or in US itself.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And a lot of countries apparently are sort of signing up to the GDPR. Like Japan is apparently taking the lead on this. So they've said, hey, we're not quite big enough to strike those kinds of deals, but now, hey, there's an API, can we be a part of it? So we're looking at ways to spread out these things. But it's not just the European Union. There's also the Council of Europe, but there's also the OECD. There's the UN, right? There's a lot of different organizations that can help us do these kinds of things. And absolutely, I think the EU is a fascinating model. It's an incredibly cheap bureaucracy. It's really for a bureaucracy of its size, it costs less than anything else. And that they strike up the treaties between themselves, and then the nations still implement the actual laws. I think that's a really good model because, again, it's making that distinction between we use this transnational organization to negotiate solutions, but then the nations are the places that actually defend their citizens. And so the nations have still a special status. So I think that, I think it's a very good model. And I'm sure it can be improved. All models can be improved. But yeah.
Last but not least, just to speak about a civilization model. Do you think that we are going to shift, or we have already shift in a new kind of civilization? I mean that we mentioned in many cases the complementary between AI, the machine, and human. There is also the question to define and to maintain the natural human skill of thinking, because much more AI everywhere in the decision making, from analytics, business intelligence, everywhere in the board of any companies, corporations, even big tech themselves. Do you think that we're going to cross through something which is the challenge of humanity? How to maintain deep human skill, natural human skill from professionals in this field, but not only, from all human, in fact?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question. So in the definitely our technology changes what it means to be human, and definitely what it means to be human now is different from 10 years ago, is different from 50 years ago, is different from 10,000 years ago. And so we do keep changing that, and we need to acknowledge and embrace and handle that. I am worried, though, a couple things. Somebody told me that the IQs have been dropping in France for 30 years. And I wonder if that's partly because we are micromanaging our children, so we're thinking as a family rather than thinking as individuals. And so then, again, some of the capacity for handling difficult cognitive problems, because you aren't ever being thrown in over your head, could be disappearing. I think that Dan Dennett talks about worried about that there's an attack vector, that if someone's at war with you, they could try to take down your internet, and then would you be able to function? And so he says we should shut down the internet for like 3 hours, once a year or something, just to make sure everybody knows how to function without it. And everybody's freaking out about this suggestion because they're like, people will die, because hospitals rely on it, police rely on it, whatever. And he's like, well, but that's the point. We need to make sure that fewer people die, because if we're in a war, they might be taken down for weeks. I mean, it's not just wars. I mean, look what happened to Puerto Rico. So you can lose power. You can lose. Look at what's happening in Venezuela. So we need to be able to do, to the best of our ability, sustain our society through periods like that. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that we wouldn't be able to keep 7 billion people alive if we suddenly lost all the agricultural technology, right? So there's something that you have to do that's somewhere in between, complete survivalism and complete, passive ignorance of threat. We have to come to some kind of place with that. And I do think, to come back to your question about the human resilience, human innovation, I think this is one of the things we should be optimizing towards. Because if individuals aren't thinking for themselves, if they don't have any cognitively challenging tasks, then they will lose their intelligence. We know this. There's this thing called the Seattle longitudinal studies that show us that the two ways that you keep your IQ into advanced stage, first of all, try to stay healthy. So obviously, if you have a heart attack or something, you might lose part of your brain. But if you stay healthy, the two best predictors of maintaining your IQ into advanced stage, it can even go up actually, is having a cognitively challenging job and having a spouse that's at least as smart as you are. So these two things keep your brain active. You're constantly competing with your spouse or
Muscle
whatever.
your brain.
Yeah, well, not just your brain. Yeah, but anyway. But the point is that we want people to flourish, and if we want innovation, we want flourishing societies, then we need to create safe spaces in which people can innovate. And I think I like the hipster movement. I think we should be focusing on increasing the economy of the arts, right? Of the individual, the artisanal arts, right? Not we need to be pulling back from these mass-scaled industries because we're an incredibly rich society. So it's not about like, how will we get by? When hardly anyone's working in agriculture. So it's much more about how do we fit into the planet we have? How do we make sure that our children don't take up more space than our parents did, and that we don't consume something that can't be replaced during the period of our life, right? Those are the hard technological questions. And some of that involves things like, instead of everybody having a bigger and bigger house, people having like better and better decorated houses, right? There's some things that are renewable and there's some things that aren't. And one of the things, we cannot have infinite numbers of people getting infinitely larger houses on a finite sized planet. But we can have people putting more and more of their time into like hand decorating their walls, right? Things like that. So it's about focusing on creativity and beauty and innovation and distinction, which may partly involve focusing on the local to a greater extent. So I really like the hipster movement, actually. I think that's really part of the solution.
Thank you very much, Joanna Joy BRYSON, for sharing your insight, and thank you again for putting all these topic and issues as high as it should be. It's a must. Thank you very much again, and see you next on the mic.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome.